have the honor and pleasure of inviting our dear friend, former Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. בבקשה.
U.S. departure from the recognition of United Jerusalem as the exclusive capital of Israel and the site of the American embassy to Israel would reflect the worldview of the State Department in Washington, which has been wrong and wronger on every single critical issue in the Middle East. It's the same State Department that did not want Israel to be established in 1948. It's the same State Department that stabbed the Shah of Iran in the back and courted Ayatollah Khomeini. It's the same State Department that courted Arafat and courted the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's the same State Department which transformed Libya into a major platform of anti-American global Islamic terrorism. Departure from the recognition of Jerusalem as the exclusive capital of Israel and the site of the American embassy would violate the American law of November 1995, which specifically stated that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, united Jerusalem, and forced the American administration to transfer the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In fact, that November 1995 American law, which is the law as we speak here this evening, only reaffirmed 1990 and 1992 concurrent resolutions by both chambers of the US Congress, which once again specified the reality of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and the site of the American embassy. Departure from the recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel would also defy reality of more than 3,000 years of Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. Moreover, departure from the recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel would be a slap in the face of America's founding fathers, who were inspired by King David's unification of the 12 tribes into one nation, which they deemed very similar to their own union of 13 colonies. It's also a slap at the face of the founding fathers, who were inspired by Jerusalem in many respects, but one example is the fact that Washington, D.C. does not belong to any state, just like Jerusalem that does not belong to any of the tribes. When one talks about the potential departure from the U.S. recognition of Israel as the exclusive capital of Israel, the site of the American embassy in Israel, one talks about a very severe setback to the U.S. posture of deterrence. The delay of the implementation of the 1995 law, the law of the embassy, the Jerusalem Embassy Act, did not bode well for the U.S. There was the illusion that delaying it would spare the U.S. terrorism, would spare the U.S. the wrath of Arab pressure and Arab Islamic terrorism. But as we know, in 1998, the U.S. suffered a severe blow when two truck bombs demolished the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania with a total of 250 fatalities. And in the year 2000, 17 American sailors were murdered by Muslim terrorists in the port of Aden, and certainly September 11 is another sign that kowtowing to Arab pressure, to Muslim terrorism, does not bode well for the US. Certainly in 2018, an American president demonstrated that the US does not shy away from defying American Arab pressure and Arab threats of terrorism. And the State Department warned President Trump that such a position would produce more terrorism against the US. They warned about a global Islamic uprising against the US. The reality was that the American very, very strong statement on Jerusalem and the strong message that one cannot push the US anymore was not followed by more terrorism. It was a setback to terrorism against the United States. When it comes to Israeli prime ministers responding to the challenge of Jerusalem, the current Israeli government should follow in the footsteps of the founding fathers of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who was pressured during the 1948-49 War of Independence to so-called end occupation of West Jerusalem. He had only one word in response: no. Not only didn't he succumb to terrorism, but after the war in 1950, when President Truman and the State Department exercised a brutal pressure on Ben-Gurion, replete with economic and diplomatic threats concerning West Jerusalem, Ben-Gurion's response was to build, construct new Jewish neighborhoods on the ceasefire line in Jerusalem and transfer to Jerusalem tens of thousands new immigrants, olim, that arrived to Israel. He certainly defied the US pressure and therefore gained long-term respect and elevated the position of Israel in the eyes of Americans. In 1967, President Lyndon Johnson pressured Prime Minister Eshkol to desist from reunification of Jerusalem. The response by Eshkol was to reunite Jerusalem, to build the first neighborhood beyond the Green Line, Ramat Eshkol, and in fact, it was Levi Eshkol, mind you, a Labour Party prime minister, who established the initial settlement in Gush Etzion, Kfar Etzion, the initial settlements in the Jordan Valley, in the Golan Heights, and in certain parts of Judea and Samaria in response to American pressure. It did not dilute respect for Eshkol and Israel. It enhanced respect for Israel because the Americans are not fools. On a rainy day, they don't look for a partner which shies away from defiance. They respect much more a defiant and able partner. The same thing was the attitude exhibited by the late Prime Minister Golda Meir, who was pressured to desist from construction in Jerusalem beyond the Green Line. And Golda Meir, again, a Labourite Prime Minister's response was to build Ramot Elon, the French Hill, Neve Yaakov, and Gilo. Today, some 150,000 Jews reside in these communities, which was the product of very constructive Israeli defiance of American pressure. Certainly, today Prime Minister Bennett should follow in the footsteps of Prime Ministers Ben-Gurion, Eshkol, Golda, Begin, and Shamir that send a clear message to Washington. Jerusalem is not negotiable. Jerusalem is the eternal and exclusive capital of Israel. And in fact, they realize very well that the attitude by the world at large towards Israel is a byproduct of our own steadfastness on Jerusalem. Thank you.
מדהים, מדהים. אנחנו ניתן לך את זה. תודה רבה. Thank you so much, former Ambassador Yoram Ettinger.